Hello there, how's it going? My name is Dr. Jack Stack, and I would like to invite you to sit with me for a few minutes and learn about a science that is near and dear to my heart, which is the science of fish history. So, a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. Jack Stack, and I am a scientist interested in the history and evolution of animals, especially fishes. I'm recording this video because I want to share my love and my interest in the science of fishes and in related sciences like biology for a broader audience, for my students and for anybody who's interested in the science that I do and in this really important science for the 21st century. So I've made this talk and I'm recording it now for broader consumption. Please bear with me. This is my first time using any of this technology, so probably won't be the highest quality, but I'm going to do my best, and I hope that you enjoy the science. So, welcome to fish history. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about here. So for our outline, I'm going to introduce what fish history is, and I apologize when I change slides, it stops recording sound. So if I get that wrong at any point, I do apologize. We're going to start with what is fish history. I'm going to move my cursor. And fish history essentially is a unification of sciences. It sits at the boundary between different fields of science and different fields of study. And it starts with our interest in these fascinating animals we call fishes, which are these bony animals that tend to live in water, right? They swim around, people keep them as pets. But to really understand fishes and their history, we actually have to use more than one science. So you may be familiar with the science of ichthyology, ichthyology being the study of fishes. But ichthyology itself, while being a fascinating and beautiful science, is not enough on its own because ichthyology tells us about fishes as living animals, but there is a lot more to them, and this is something I can talk about as a paleontologist. So paleontology is the study of fossils. It's the study of the history of life as recorded in the fossil record. And this is where I come in. I am a fish paleontologist, meaning that all of my work sits at the intersection of the sciences of ichthyology and paleontology. So it's not the study of pails, it is the study of fossils and specifically the history of life as recorded by the fossil record. And then, as you may have guessed, we also have to bring in the science and this not really the science, but the field, the discipline of history. That is our history as a species, as humans, and our history of interactions with fishes. Because humans have been interacting with fishes for tens of thousands of years, probably longer, as a source of food, as a source of even medicine in some cases, and as objects of our culture. So I came up with this term fish history to deal with the fact that to understand not only fishes, but ourselves in relationship to fishes, we have to integrate these three areas of study. So fish history is not one field of study, it is at the nexus of ichthyology, paleontology, and history. And my goal as a scientist is to explore these stories of of fish history and bring them to you. Because the reason I'm doing this, right, is I truly believe that this science is critical to every single person, whether you are interested in fishes or not. I think that these animals and our interactions with them are incredibly important to our society, our health, our wealth, and our welfare as a species. And I think these stories that come from the intersection of fish science, fossil science, and history are incredibly important for everybody to hear. Think of me as your personal guide through this science and through these stories, and I will be happy to share some of them. Forward here, so we've discussed what fish history is. Now we're going to talk about one of the most frequently asked questions I get as a fish scientist. The word fish can be singular, right? You can refer to an individual like this goldfish drawing here, right? This is a fish. The word fish can also be plural. You can refer to multiple individuals of the same type or the same species of fish. So for example, we have two goldfish. So you could accurately say we have these fish, plural. Now here's where the confusion comes in. What do I do when I have multiple types or kinds or species of fish that I am referring to? Let's say you have a tank with goldfish and angelfish in it. What word do you use? Well, technically, the word you use is fishes. You have a group of fishes here. Now, I'm not too much of a stickler. I'm not going to grammatically correct you on this, but this is the question I get asked the most frequently: is what's the deal with fish and fishes, right? So now you know, right? And now you can be the really annoying friend at parties who tells people correct grammar and such. So I'm going to use this term fishes a lot. And this is what I'm referring to, right? Is that we have multiple types or kinds or species of fishes is the correct way of using this. So let's talk about, well, why do fish and fishes matter, right? Like why would somebody spend their time studying this group of animals? And I think it's underappreciated how important fish and fishes are to ourselves as a society, as a species. The most obvious answer is that fishes are a major food source for human beings, and I did not fully appreciate how important this was until I did a little research. So fishes are, of course, food for animals, right? It's an important part of the ecosystem that fishes are basically this food source for a lot of larger predators, animals that we're interested in, like bears here, right? But also for us, right? We eat fish. Fish are a major source of not only food, but protein for human beings. And I learned that I did not know this before I made this talk, that fishes are the primary source of protein for over 3 billion people on Earth. Think about that. 3 billion people rely on fishes as their primary source of protein, which is this critical part of your diet, right? So this is huge, right? Fishes, this group of animals, is not just, the subject of academic interest, right? It's also this primary source of food for over 3 billion people. That's a lot. And of course, fishes are not only used for food, right? They're also an essential part of, like, if you go down the vitamin aisle in your grocery store, you'll see these fish oil pills. I've actually never taken those, but they're also used, their products are also used not just as food, but also for health and other such products. Fishes are not just, we don't just pick fish out of the water and eat them, right? There's a whole industry built up around finding and harvesting fishes called the fisheries industry, right? So fisheries encompass basically the people who are employed in catching, harvesting, preparing, selling fish and fishes as primarily as food, right? So here we have a fish market, for example, right? This is where fish are being bought and sold as food primarily. And I learned, again, in making this talk, that fisheries employ over 260 million people around the globe, right? So 260 million people, their primary job, right, their mode of gathering income is through fisheries. So very important source of income and employment. And I actually have a personal connection to this. My great grandfather, Charles Matthew Anderson, was a fisherman and a captain of a fishing boat. So this is the Evelyn S. This is one of his boats where they were fishers in the Great Lakes fishery, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I also, again, have a personal connection to this. Members of my family were employed in fisheries. And of course, fishes are also really important for sport. So people don't just catch fish to eat them. People catch fish for fun, right? And I personally love fishing. I'm not actually very good at it, which is funny, but there are other people who are really good at it. And there's this massive industry and this massive cultural interest in pursuing fishes as sport for fun, right? And anglers are some of the most important people in terms of conservation of fishes. I can't say enough good things about anglers. I've learned so much from anglers, and all their knowledge about fishes is also incredibly important to fish history. And throughout these talks, we'll be relying upon accounts and information that comes from anglers and not just fish scientists, right? Anglers know a lot. And people have been catching fish for tens of thousands of years, right? You could go to the sporting goods store and buy a fishing rod, but 10,000 years ago, right, people were creating tools for catching fishes that we find in archaeological sites. So these are fish hooks that are well over 10,000 years old, right? So fish as sport is not something that's new. People have been catching fish for tens of thousands of years, and people are going to keep doing it as long as human beings are alive. We love catching fish, not just for food, right? People do it for fun as well. I myself as well. And finally, we have fishes as pets, right? People keep fishes as pets, and they have been doing so, again, for thousands of years, right? Koi and goldfish being the best examples, right, as fishes that have been kept as pets for thousands of years. But people, sorry, 1 second, to this day, right, keep fishes as pets, not just as personal pets, but we have these wonderful places called aquariums, right, where people keep larger and more exotic fish, often for the purpose of conservation, right? And aquariums are a wonderful source of conservation and science and places to go be inspired and learn about fishes. So we'll be talking a lot about not only things that come from sort of the literature, like the scientific literature of fishes, but there is an enormous amount of information, particularly on the growth and disease and behavior of fishes that comes from amateur or hobbyist aquarists, I think is what they call themselves, right? I actually do not keep fish because I have a pet cat, but we're going to talk a lot about information that comes from people who keep fishes. And some of the most important work in fish history has been done by people who keep fishes for fun rather than people who are professional scientists, if you will. And I bring this piece of art up a lot. This is fishes swimming amid falling flowers. It is an over 1,000-year-old piece of art that is done to basically represent the beauty of fishes, right? And I love this piece not only because it is extraordinarily well done, but because it shows us how long fishes have been part of our culture, right? This person, who I never met, lived in China centuries before I was born, had the same love and appreciation for fishes that I do. And I think there's something so interesting and beautiful about our connection with these animals as a species. So why do fishes matter, right? Why are we interested in fish history and the science of fishes? Well, we're interested in them because food, as pets, as sport, and frankly, because humans love fishes, and they have been part of our culture for thousands of years, both as friends, right, as pets, as enemies, as prey, and just as objects of cultural interest, right? Next time you go to an art museum, look around. I play this game whenever I go to like an art museum. I look to see how many fish I can find, and I've been surprised at how often fish show up in art, even art that's thousands of years old from all over the world, right? People like to draw fish. It's just a big part of our culture. So now let's talk a little bit about what we can learn from fish history. And we'll have dedicated lectures. But I want to give you a couple of takeaways from what I have learned in my study of fish history. So the fossil record of fishes, that is the paleontological side of fishes, is really what we're going to get into a lot. I am a fish paleontologist. I am very interested in this. This is a reconstruction of a fossil fish from the Devonian period of Michigan. So it's about a 380 million year old fish that lived in what is now the lower peninsula of Michigan, but what was then this sort of shallow tropical marine inland sea that was full of fish like this. And this is an animal called Protitanichthys rockportensis. This beautiful piece of art was done by a colleague of mine named Megan Sodano, by the way. And I had the opportunity to collect fossils of this fish when I was in high school and study them. And I learned something really profound in studying not only Protitanichthys here, but also the group of fishes that it's from. There are no fishes like this today. This is an animal called a placoderm. Placoderm referring to these really thick, bony plates in the animal's skin, right? They're often called the armored fishes, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but that's okay. This group of fishes was extremely successful for tens of millions of years. We find them all over the world. They are the dominant component of of marine and freshwater habitats. They're everywhere in the Devonian, but they're all extinct, and they went extinct pretty frequently, or not frequently, pretty quickly in geologic terms because of a major shift in the global environment that we call the Hangenberg crisis, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. But in not just, fossils aren't just like, oh, look at this weird animal, right? They show us that extinction is something that has happened in the past and imply that we are not immune to extinction, right? We are not special or different from this placoderm in that we can't go extinct, right? Placoderms were around a lot longer than humans have been, and there's no reason to think that some major change in our habitat that we depend upon couldn't drive us to extinction as well. So we're going to talk a lot about the fossil record, not just in terms of, hey, look at this cool fossil fish, but also what do we learn from the fossil record? And extinction is going to be a big part of it, but not the only thing, right? It's not just all doom and gloom. There's also a lot of really interesting patterns in the history of fishes, right? It's not all, well, and then this thing died. This is an animal that I worked on in my PhD called Sorichtes. Sorichtes is a extinct fish that is found all over the world in the Triassic period. This species, which is from the late Triassic of Texas, is about 220 million years old, that I described last year. And it is known only from the upper jaw here. So the rest of this is based on a species from Madagascar. But Sorichtes is fascinating because it has this striking anatomy. So you're looking at it in left lateral view, so the left side of the animal, and notice these long, toothy jaws that this animal has, right? These long jaws in this almost arrow-shaped body, right? It's long and thin. It's got these large fins at the back of the body, right? Fish scientists call this a sagittiform body shape, meaning arrow-shaped. And we think that Sorichtes, right, probably was a fast-swimming, fast-accelerating predator, very similar to a living fish called the needlefish, right? So if you're an angler interested in marine fishes, you may already be familiar with needlefishes, which also have this elongate, sort of arrow-shaped body with these long, toothy jaws. And you might think, hey, is Sorichtes an ancient needlefish, right? They look superficially similar, but when you look more closely at these animals' anatomy, we find that Sorichtes is part of a very ancient, now extinct group of fishes, and needlefishes evolved much later, right? So needlefishes were not around in the Triassic, even though there are these species of fishes that look for all the world like a Triassic needlefish. So what we learn from these animals and from fossils like Sorichtes is that the history of fishes has repeated itself. And something I'm very interested in as a scientist is this phenomenon called convergent evolution, which is the idea that evolution, that the history of life, essentially, can create the same or very similar forms over and over again in the history of life. So we're going to talk about this, but I think the critical broader takeaway here, right, is that because the history is repeating itself, right, we can use history as a guide to understand what might happen in the future, right? The future is not easily predicted, but we can learn about things that may happen in the future from things that have happened in the past, right? So, fish history does repeat itself. And there's those really long jaws and that long arrow-shaped body I talked about. So, as I mentioned, the history of life can teach us about the future of life. And I want to give you a more specific example, right? Because this is kind of broad, right? This basically tells you, hey, in like 10 to 50 million years, there'll probably be another group of fishes that evolves an arrow-shaped body, right? You might be like, well, what is that? Like, why is that important? Let me give you a more, let's say, direct example. So fishes, I've been talking, I love fishes, right? They're these wonderful animals, but they can also be a hazard, right? So anybody who's from the Great Lakes region knows what these are, but if you're not, let me give you an explanation. This is a lake trout that has parasitic lamprey attached to it. Lamprey are a type of jawless fish. It kind of looks like a leech, but it's actually not a leech. Leeches are part of a group of segmented worms. Lamprey are this extremely ancient, but still around today, group of jawless fishes. They've been around for hundreds of millions of years, right? They are fishes. They're not closely related to other bony fishes, but they are fishes, and they are extraordinarily good at parasitizing other fishes. And lamprey scientists will be like, hold on, not all lamprey are parasitic, which is true, right? The sea lamprey, which is an invasive species in the Great Lakes, has a parasitic stage to its life cycle where its jawless mouth essentially acts as a suction cup and it goes whoop onto fishes. And these rasping tooth-like structures on its tongue come out and erode and basically eat the animal's flesh, leaving these circular sucker-shaped wounds in the fish, often leading to death of the fish, right? Imagine, I mean, don't imagine that's an awful thing to imagine, right? But you can understand that even though it's not necessarily a fatal interaction, this parasitic interaction is extremely bad for fishes. And unfortunately, the sea lamprey was introduced to the Great Lakes by human activity. So the sea lamprey essentially we think, got into the Great Lakes because of the building of this canal that allowed shipping from the Atlantic Ocean to more easily reach the Great Lakes, essentially. And larger ships essentially were able to get in. And these sea lamprey were an basically accidentally brought along for the ride. And the sea lamprey in the mid part of the 20th century essentially completely destroyed the Great Lakes fishery. So this interaction, like we're seeing in this image, unfortunately happened all throughout the Great Lakes and took an already sort of teetering fishery because the lake trout were already overfished. But this essentially was the last sort of this essentially was the last Jenga block, right, that got pulled out and collapsed the tower. Let's see, advance here. So I mentioned my great grandfather was a sea captain in the Great Lakes fishery, and the sea lamprey. He writes this account of how the invasion of the sea lamprey, or what he calls the lamprey eels, was sort of the last straw for the Great Lakes fishery, and the the lake trout Great Lakes fishery completely collapsed. It took many years for the sea lamprey to become controlled. The lake trout population has never really fully recovered, although the Great Lakes fishery has recovered after decades of really hard work by the United States Fisheries and Wildlife Service. And the reason my grandfather's boat is on display at a museum is because he went out of business, right? They had to sell the boat, had to, end the business because of the loss of the Great Lakes fishery. And that's just one person out of the many who were employed in this fishery, right? So fish history, right? Understanding what sea lamprey are, the fact that they are an extremely ancient group of fishes that has been around for a long time. They're extremely hardy, right? And understanding like, hey, this is a parasitic species, and if it gets into our Great Lakes, it's going to cause a lot of damage, right? And the sea lamprey haven't been eradicated. They're still there. They're just carefully controlled now to stop their population from getting too high, essentially. So this kind of fish historical knowledge is so important so that we can avoid the mistakes of the past, right? We can remember these stories, like those told by my great grandfather, to prevent the destruction of fisheries, prevent people from losing their welfare, prevent people from losing their jobs and losing a source of food in this case. So the Great Lakes fishery was almost permanently destroyed, right? The loss of the lake trout caused all these downstream effects. There were decades of damage that were done to the Great Lakes fishery that we're still seeing, right? You can still see some of the effects of this in the species that are around today, and there are other invasive species that must be carefully controlled, right? So something else we're going to talk about in these lectures is not, just the academic, the scientific literature, right? I could recommend that if people are interested, but I really want to tell these human stories, right? How people are interacting with fishes in good and bad ways, and what we can learn from it as a society and as a species. And a big thing from this story is the importance of careful management of our fisheries and our waterways as these critical natural resources for our health and welfare. So, yeah, invasive species are a major threat and something we have to think about. So, fish history. In this very short introductory lecture, we've talked about ichthyology, paleontology, and history. We've learned about invasive species like the sea lamprey. We've learned about historical, unfortunately, destruction of fisheries like the Great Lakes fishery and my great grandfather's fishing boat. We've learned about really crazy fossil species like Serichthes with this weird anatomy and the fact that this body form is shown up multiple times. And of course, we've learned about some interesting extinct fishes like Protitanichthes here. So I hope you've enjoyed. I'm planning to do more lectures like this, longer lectures potentially. If there are any topics you are interested in, you can feel free to reach out. I write up a lot of these stories on my Substack, which is Fish History on Substack. I am also on Patreon if you would like to provide any support. Much appreciated. And you, of course, can message me directly, fishhistory@yahoo.com or Jackstack Paleobiologist on Facebook or at jackstack.bluesky.social. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time and your attention. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Have a wonderful day.